Hello? So can you hear me? Okay. We are actually doing a different style than all our events. We did it before. It was in a webinar. Now we are doing in a meetup session. So the way we are doing reason is at the end of the presentation, gonna have breakout sessions, breakout rooms, and in small groups. The idea is we're gonna encourage people to network. That's the whole idea with the Meetup app. And because due to COVID, we cannot meet in person. And now we'll give it a try this time, how it's gonna work out. And if it is, we're gonna have several events like that. Actually, I can tell you that in the next 2 months, we are gonna have like 15, 20 events. So it would be really fun summer for data science in Bay Area. So that's not on the Bay Area, that's in everywhere. So what I do usually, just while still people are joining in, I do a short survey that if you guys can write in the chat box where you guys are joining from, I will appreciate it. And meantime, I can make some introduction. And so I'm Murat. I'm the CEO of Magnimind Academy. So where we focus on data science and data science above and beyond and A to Z. And we have several boot camps, mini boot camps, a lot of free ones. And this meetup groups we have in 7 different locations, and now we are doing it online. And we have over 10,000 members. And in these meetup groups, we have a lot of free events, free lectures. And if you guys are not aware of meetup groups, our friends sharing all the different different group lists. So you can be a member of those lists. And so we are organizing free mini boot camps, and we are organizing several lectures and workshops and career events. And we have all these events are recorded, not all of them. We started to record since COVID in YouTube channel, and YouTube channel have very decent lectures. I recommend you guys watching it there. And our friends share the YouTube channel. And if you actually scroll down in the different lectures, you'll find a lot of interesting topics. You'll find the ones that you may be interested in. And I really recommend everyone, that's what we're doing, to understand the different areas of the data science and listen to different lectures. So this is a quick overview of our events and who we are. And we are also planning a good interactive Clubhouse events. Although our meetup Zoom events is pretty good, but we're gonna do also Clubhouse events. So today, we have a guest from remote, and he's Prathamesh. Do I say it right? I'm sorry if I don't.
That's right, no problem. Hi, everyone.
And also my name, and people say my name, how do you say it? I say every way of you saying is okay. Don't call me Rat. So Prathamesh is an experienced professional. He has an interest and expertise in several data science fields: AI and NLP, text analytics, deep learning, machine learning. And he is honored with the India's Top 40 Under 40 Data Scientists Award by Analytics India magazine. And he was selected member of advisory technical committee in International Conference on Next Generation Computing Technologies. He has published several papers and presented several papers in these areas of AI, NLP, ML, deep learning, and advanced analytics. It's actually our privilege to host him here today. And as a reminder, at the end of the session, we're going to have a networking session and we're going to breakout rooms. We're going to have a short breakout rooms in 5 minutes, and then we'll meet with different people. Hope that works out, and we'll just have another good way to serve the community. Thank you. Are you able to share your screen, Prathamesh?
Yeah, let me just try. I think I should be able to. Yeah, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Great.
You guys can also ask your question from the chat sessions. Okay.
So shall we start?
Oh, yes, please.
Sure. Thanks a lot. So thanks, Magnimind Academy, Murat, and all the participants joining from all the different parts of the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Myself, Prathamesh, I am part of the Merck, let's say Merck Group organization, which is basically in the areas of healthcare, life science, and performance materials or electronics. So it's basically a pharmaceutical organization, and I represent a team called Merck Data Office. It is a central team within our organization, which basically is responsible for designing, building, developing, and deploying state-of-the-art enterprise natural language processing and artificial intelligence solutions for a variety of our different businesses. So, so I work as a principal data scientist, and I lead a team of NLP experts and data engineers to set up, design, and build our enterprise products and capabilities in the area of NLP and NLP and AI, to be precise. And today we'll spend next 45 odd minutes to understand one of our use case that we built around the COVID literature. So this was part of one of the challenge that is hosted by National Institutes of Standards. So here the idea was to understand and see what kind of information can be extracted from the free text, let's say 10 pager, 15 pager long COVID literature documents, and how ultimately those specific data points can be used for further analysis and further actions purposes in terms of, let's say, understanding the medical innovations, etc. So without further ado, let's jump into the actual presentation. So basically, as part of the agenda, we'll basically focus on various different things. I just want to give you some flavor in terms of how the current market is poised for NLP, specifically in healthcare and life science, because what happens is typically this industry or this particular organization is kind of bound by regulatory and compliance factors. So it becomes very tricky to see how some of the state-of-the-art techniques like natural language processing or artificial intelligence are implemented here. So idea is to really understand and see what are some of the challenges that we overcome. And of course, then we do a deep dive into the use case that we built for the COVID literature. And then we touch upon some of the specific technical components in terms of what are some of the explorations that we did using the embeddings techniques or the vector-based searching technique. And finally, what was the outcome of this data challenge and where do we stand? So that is something that we'll cover for next 40-45 minutes. So let me just quickly spend a minute or two on this slide. So typically, we know that artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning is kind of the state of the art or the need of the hour in terms of implementing large scale enterprise solution where we want to analyze large amounts of text data, voice data, images, etc. So to get actionable insights out of the data. And if I specifically look at the NLP across industries, so what we see is that by 2022 or by 2023, within the span of next 2 years, this specific market, so the enterprise products, enterprise solutions, or the industries who will invest in this technology will grow by at least 24%. So the idea is that by 2023, this market will reach up to 30 billion US dollars. So That's the growth at which NLP market is growing, because you see on a day-to-day basis, a lot of product organization, a lot of startups are jumping into understanding how we can process unstructured data, how we can process speech data, etc. So I think NLP is now capturing a lot of attention from different research communities as well as academic communities to contribute to specific use cases or contribute to some of the problems that we are trying to solve. Then just to understand how the market is poised for pharma, because being in a pharma organization, I see a lot of data getting generated, because pharma organizations generate a lot of, let's say, textual documents for, let's say, products, or let's say efficacy of the product, safety of the product, marketing of the product, etc. So a lot of textual data gets generated. And since, as I said, this is a highly regulated environment, so we have to be very crucial when we handle this kind of data. So how the market is currently standing for, let's say, NLP in specifically in pharma organization is, we see that the market started taking up pace somewhere around 2016, because if you remember, there was a time where there was a sudden boom in terms of Stanford NLP or Allen NLP, or a lot of IBM Watsons getting noticed in the different research communities, and then the market started taking up. So now currently we are standing somewhere close to 2022, 2023, and we see that by let's say 2025, this market alone for pharma organizations is going to be growing up to 6.25 billion US dollars. So the market is growing at 22% rate. So all the enthusiasts who want to get into NLP, or all the colleagues who want to, let's say, develop some products in the NLP, now is a time, because as I said, healthcare organizations generate a lot of data, and it kind of becomes a lot easier to kind of develop solutions in this area and prove the value that NLP can bring in for any pharmaceutical organization. So that was just to give you a sense in terms of how the market for NLP is currently standing in the healthcare space. But even though we see that there are sudden adoptions which are happening, but there are still challenges which let's say stops the pharma organizations or the healthcare organizations from using NLP or using these state-of-the-art technologies. We see a lot of explorations happening. We hear all about BioBert, we hear about GPT-2, we hear about GPT-3, but since this is a very regulated environment, it becomes very necessary to understand what are some of these industry challenges and how you can overcome them. So first major challenge is that data is growing at an exponential rate. As I said, the data gets generated on a day-to-day basis as we speak, data for literature, data for drug discovery, data for drug development, data for post-marketing studies, data for clinical trials, etc. So a lot of data points are getting generated, and they are all in unstructured form. The data can be in the form of scanned documents, data can be in the form of PDFs, the data can be in the form of Word documents, etc. Many different data points. So the growth at which the unstructured text is growing within any pharmaceutical organization is exponential as we speak. Then the next component is variety. So we talked about velocity. So the growth at which the data is increasing in pharmaceutical organizations. The second component or the second critical challenge is the variety of the data. We have clinical data. So you would have heard recently that a lot of clinical trials were happening within different pharma organizations to test the COVID vaccine. It's a general example. So if we talk about, let's say, 10 different vaccines, 4 to 5 phases of different trials, so you can imagine how much data is getting generated specifically for clinical trials of one single vaccine. Now we talk about different pharma organizations designing, developing different products in the area of oncology or cancer, neurology or immunology, fertility, endocrinology, etc. So you can imagine the amount at which the data is growing, and the variety is different. So we have clinical trial data, we have medical affairs, or we have medical data which talks about interactions between a healthcare professional or a hospital or a doctor, etc. And then finally regulatory. So the submissions that happen to the regulatory authorities. So it can be about, let's say, the adverse event which is observed after taking a particular drug or a product. So this is basically a standard, but as I said, the data is all unstructured. So that's one of the critical challenge that any pharmaceutical organization is observed with. Let me just try to show you a landscape. So too much data ambiguity and too much complexity. So just to start with different synonyms. So we refer to a same product with 5, 6 different names, for example. So there can be an active ingredient, there can be a WHO specific name that is given to an active ingredient. There are different codes which are used for same active ingredients. We have trade names. So for example, when organizations or when pharma organizations market their drugs, they have specific names for their products, which we call it as trade name. So in this case, interferon is something, an active ingredient, and Rebif is a trade name. So too many names and they're all synonyms. So again, the confusion there. Then too much tabular data. So the data which is captured during each and every stage of drug development or drug discovery. So again, a lot of data points captured in tables. These tables are in different form and shape. So I think it becomes very tricky to process and mine such kind of complex data. Then again, scanned documents, it can be doctor notes, it can be prescriptions, it can be anything which are in the form of scanned documents. And then idea is to really process and understand and see how we can use this specific data and then generate actionable insights out of it. We obviously don't have to talk about languages because across the globe, different countries, different data in different languages. So again, that's a particular component or a complexity that gets added into the data. Then we have basically the formats. As I said, we have Word documents, we have JPEG images, we have PNG images, we have bitmap images, etc. So we have Excel files, Word files. So we have all kinds of files which are storing the textual data. And then finally, abbreviations. So what happens is a particular term. So let's say, for example, if a doctor or if a particular healthcare professional wants to refer a simple stomach pain, it can be stomach bloating, it can be stomach pain, abdominal pain, stomach cramps, stomach disturb. So it can be anything. So like what you see in the example here. So the same abbreviation can be referred for different components. So it can be about right arterial with a different code. It can be about rheumatoid arthritis. It can be about refractory anemia. It can be about multiple different things. So understanding the right abbreviation and then kind of using it correctly as a part of your analysis is very critical. And then finally, when we look at the data points like patents, when we look at data points like scientific literature, we see a lot of pictures, we see a lot of graphs, we see a lot of chemical diagrams, we see a lot of chemical synthesis diagrams. So again, those particular data points also convey some kind of information that should be used for day-to-day activities. So too many data points, too many variety of data points, that adds up to complexity. So that's one of the major challenge that any healthcare or a life science industry observes. Then the third major challenge that we see as an organization is regulatory concerns, because each and every data point needs to be reported back to regulatory authorities. And since it has sensitivity in terms of, let's say, it can be patient information, it can be, let's say, a product information, it can be anything. So because of these sensitive data points, most of the industries, or let's say most of the pharma organizations, stop themselves from investing into these kind of technologies, because again, you have to prove the value of it, you have to ensure that it is audited right, you have to ensure that it's audit trailed, so everything. So rather than having all those headaches, most of the organizations say that, okay, let's not get into that, and then kind of it stops them from using such kind of state of the art technologies. And then finally, because all these above 3 points, data remains untouched. So most of the explorations that you see on a day-to-day basis happening specifically in NLP related to pharma or related to healthcare is all open source. So you look at PubMed data, you look at MedRxiv data, you look at WHO articles, you look at Medline articles, you look at 50 different things, but they're all public domain data points. And when we try to use these public domain built models or embeddings or any kind of algorithms, it tends to fail because of the specific components which are written in the pharma data points. So that is something that again causes a trouble where the data remains untouched, and none of the business components or any of the uh, let's say SMEs cannot take any actionable insights out of this data. So after understanding all these different challenges, definitely we have built solutions, we have developed solutions which are productionized, and recently our paper is also getting published, wherein we have explained how we use state of the art concepts of weakly supervised learning to analyze and process the medical data. So I think there is a adoption which is happening for NLP, but it's slow. So the idea here is that all the techniques or all the components or all the algorithms models that we build, we have to ensure that they are robust enough to adopt to some of these specific nuances that these industries add. So in a nutshell, that's the message, that when we are thinking about developing a model or an algorithm, ensure that you are taking into account all these different components so that adoption is faster by these different industries. Now, let's jump into the actual use case which we developed and which for which we participated in the TREC competition, which was organized by NIST. So as you see, this particular work that we developed or built or experimented with was developed for National Institute of Standards and Technology. So every year NIST organizes a competition called TREC, Text Retrieval Challenge, wherein you are given a corpus of different articles, and through different rounds of explorations, you have to ensure that your NLP model is trained enough to capture and identify relevant data points for any search query. So it's basically a text retrieval challenge where you have to pull the relevant literature articles or pull the relevant data points from the corpus of different articles. So similarly, due to the widespread of COVID-19, this year TREC organized a TREC COVID, where the idea is to look at different types of articles and then see how we can basically take a value out of it. But again, in terms of background, we all know growing risk of COVID-19. So that's the reason we are all connecting remotely now. So there was a extreme need to understand how we can at least break the chain, if not cure. So a lot of information was getting researched, or a lot of people were doing explorations to understand how at least we can break the chain if we cannot cure the disease, or if we are in the process of identifying a cure for the disease. But what happens is, in this case, there is a significant research which is available. So when we look at the different resources which are available, so if we look at a PubMed, which is kind of like a truth of all the different sources which are having. So we have scientific literatures which are published in PubMed or BioRxiv, MedRxiv, and they are housing different literature articles which are talking about similar situations. So if we look at the current literature that is getting published, it may talk about all the variants that COVID generated. So it can be Delta, it can be Delta plus, it can be anything. So the idea was to see whether we can use this literature or this research, which was done on a different epidemic or pandemic, just to understand what were the measures that were taken to stop the pandemic or epidemic spread. So it may not be exactly applicable, or it may not be exactly valuable for, let's say, the current situation, but at least we can get some hints, we can get some ideas. So that's where there was a lot of interest from different research communities to look at these literature articles and see how we can leverage these different data points and see how we can generate some analytics out of it. When we say analytics, it can be either some kind of an action or some suggestions that we want to generate out of this. So let's say, for example, we want to understand, are there any medical interventions that we should do? So how we can stop the spread through medical interventions versus non-pharma interventions. So when we say non-pharma interventions, it is more or less about whether we should ban the travel between the countries, whether we should stop the movement of people, whether we should do a lockdown. So these are some of the non-pharma interventions that we want to explore. And finally, with this, our idea was to bring in some approach or an engine which was developed in-house, but still understanding the nuances that we have within the pharma organization, bringing the engine in such a way that these methods or these approaches can be used further by different research communities, and they can explore upon this. So we tried to explore multiple different things just to see how the concepts of deep learning along with search and NLP would work together, just to look through these different articles and get the actionable insights out of it. So this was the background wherein we started this particular exploration on the COVID literature. So just to give you a bit of a introduction. So now we know the background of why we wanted to do this particular exploration, or why we wanted to develop or build on this use case. But unless there is a proper business challenge or a problem statement, you will basically try to explore 50 different areas, and it ends up in nothing, because you start something and it ends up in a situation that either it's a deadlock or it's not giving a value. So what we decided, that we decided to take a portion of this entire use case and say that, okay, we want to use techniques of deep learning or machine learning along with text analytics to identify accurate literature associated with a query that you want to look for. But this is not a typical fuzzy match, or this is not a typical Google like interface where we want to just search and you get all the possible results. Here we wanted to deep dive into the specific sections of these documents or literature articles and provide an exactly relevant section where an answer can be identified or can be found. So that was the idea that we wanted to build as a problem statement that we kept in front of us. So then in that case, what we should look for, because when we are looking at these articles, there are different types of articles. It can be, as I said, medical, it can be a non-pharma, etc. So in general, what we wanted to identify, so some of the queries can be, are there any equity and barriers to compliance when it comes to non-pharmaceutical interventions? So people not following proper guidelines, are there any equity issues when we are uh, implementing such kind of compliance? So that is something that we want to understand. Of course, we want to definitely understand how to control the spread in communities. So how to ensure that high risk group people like pregnant ladies or elderly people are protected from the spread of the COVID, etc. So we want to understand some of the compliance related to that. Then we also want to understand, are the travel bans or bans on mass gatherings were really effective or not? So that is something that we can analyze and see whether it worked in the past, and if there is a literature which is published on the current situation too, how effective was it? And if tomorrow, touch wood, if we get some situation like this, whether we'll be able to equip with such kind of methodologies. So all these different questions, we wanted to explore these different questions by looking at and by analyzing these different literature articles or different literature papers or scientific papers to identify right answers or right measures. So let's look at what was the data, because it's very crucial to understand what was the data set that we used. It's all open source data set, so you can also explore and experiment with it. So this is basically a snapshot of the data. So it was a combination of different let's say different literature articles coming from different sources. So we looked at close to 120,000 articles. Now when we say 120,000 articles, it's not just a one pager article. It can be 5 pager, it can be 10 pager, it can be a 50 pager research too. So the data, as you can imagine, the data is kind of lengthy because the size of the text is quite huge, and we have to understand and identify exactly a relevant section which can answer the query that a user or a researcher wants to work on. So that is something that we are looking at. So that's why we looked at close to 120,000 articles, and as we speak, they are still growing, right? Because when we are looking at these articles, every day, every week, somebody is publishing a research on COVID or COVID vaccine. So idea is to really understand and see how we can effectively ensure that this data is continuously updated so that system can be improved on a day-to-day basis. So what were the sources of data? So the sources of data were, of course, PubMed, as I said. So PubMed has a PubMed Central, which is an open access corpus. So the query was fired to get the data from PMC. Then additional research articles which are maintained by WHO, and some preprints of bioRxiv and medRxiv, which kind of houses the biomedical data associated with COVID or any similar pandemics in the past. So we looked at data for last 10 to 20 years because we wanted to understand different components, so that how we can identify better measures to stop the spread, etc. So that's why we decided that, okay, let's look at the data for last 20 years so that we cover maximum permutation combinations from the data. And of course, this data set is managed and maintained by different research organizations in coordination with White House Office of Science and Technology. So basically, the idea is to use this data, create or develop a engine or a solution that can be used to identify or to see how we can effectively use this literature article for our day-to-day activities. So this is basically a high-level system view So when we are looking at a system, I think it's very crucial to understand, okay, what kind of information we are processing and how we want to process the information, because we are on a journey. So we want to explore multiple different things and see how we can improve our engine so that the better documents are returned or better sections are returned by the information. So we have three different components, or we have three different phases, and we have successfully completed the phase one, and our business users are actually using this phase one as we speak, and I'll show you a glimpse of the solution too. But yeah, so so let's say, for example, you can keep yourself in the shoes of a business user who wants to look for a certain information or a certain literature article from these different sources. So it can be PubMed, it can be WHO corpus, or it can be preprints of biomedical literature articles. So typically what would happen, a business user would post a question. So let's say, for example, impact of COVID on pregnant women and children below 5 years. So now what happens is, algorithm or this query resolution engine that you see here needs to understand what really user wants to understand. So we are using different embeddings techniques, we are using different NLP techniques to identify and understand how we can basically find what are some of the key points that a user is explaining in the question which is fired to this query resolution engine. So the idea is that we parse the query, we try to understand and identify how this query is written. Are there any specific points which a user has stressed upon? And then finally, this query is passed into a search engine or a search, let's say, search vector search kind of a scenario. So here we have explored two components. We explored Facebook's open source search capability, which they open sourced based on the concept of vector. So I'll spread a light on that too. But we wanted to explore and see how the vector search on, let's say, 100,000 literature articles would work, and how we can effectively extract data out of such a huge corpus. That's one. And secondly, Elasticsearch, which is one of the NoSQL database, and our organization kind of uses it as an enterprise solution. We wanted to explore the recent version too, just to understand how it works, because they offer a lot of out of the box embedding techniques too. So the idea was to explore and see how effectively both the systems work and which one gives better results in optimum time. So you can imagine this as a not as a graph per se, but kind of like a connected network where each and every article is linked to other one in some way or the other. So when a user is asking a question, this particular search component will try to look for a particular section or a particular part of the document in this entire vector. And then the relevant information would be returned based on the search query which was fired as an embedding, and then it is returned back to the user. So we are not just returning a sentence, instead we return the link to the actual article too, so that if a user wants to look at the actual article, then there's an option to look at the actual article too. And this is all enabled with REST services. So we use Lambda services to enable this as a REST API, so that any user within our organization can consume it and then understand and see how it is working. So this is all about phase one. In phase two, what we are trying to explore is, when we say Q&A identification, it typically happens that you ask a question and you get a part of a document returned as an answer. What we want to do is we want to generate a Q&A system which returns factual answers. So for example, what is the incubation period for COVID-19? So it can be 10 to 14 days, or it can be 14 to 28 days. So these are factual answers. So we want to develop an engine which can return us factual answers. So that is something that we are exploring currently on the concept of a BERT, and then how we can use concepts of BERT along with a deep neural network to identify such answers, factual answers. And then finally, the phase three is something where we want to experiment with reinforcement learning. So idea is to understand and see, based on the expert feedback through the interface, we want to capture that as a training data and see whether we can improve this search vector, or whether we can improve this search capability, so that next time when a user is asking a similar question in the similar context, the algorithm is not making the same mistake. Instead, it learns from the comments given by the expert user and then provides the relevant answer. So that is something that we are exploring as phase 3. But definitely we try to explore different components, see how it works, see whether it is really optimum in terms of time perspective, because when we are looking at these large size vectors, time is one of the factor that we definitely want to look at. So this is something that we created as a high level view of the system that we want to develop and build. So so moving forward, this is basically a one step closer to our approach actually. So as you can see, this is the data which we were getting. So of course it was a JSON document, and we just, for a sake of representation purpose, we have represented it in a tabular format. So we have data coming from different articles, we have data coming from different sources. So this is talking about vaccines and the specific biothreat agents present when it comes to the clinical development of the vaccine. So this is one of the example. So let's see in a real-time scenario what happens is we have a data set. So we have data set of 120,000 articles, and we are using techniques of NLTK, JSON parser, and we have a in-house algorithm that extracts the theme or these central components that express the context of the specific question which is asked. So then we convert the data set into documents. Now documents can be either paragraph, documents can be either sentences, or documents can be either specific sections that we want to explore. So we have used Google's universal sentence encoder to experiment. Of course, we know that there are techniques of BioBird, SkyBird, but we wanted to experiment and see how universal sentence encoder, or USC known generally, how it performs or behaves on such a specific data which is of a biomedical type. So we generated embeddings using the USC encoder, and then if a user is entering a query, or if a user wants to execute a query in real time, what would happen? So we basically apply the USC on the query itself. So we get the query embeddings, and these query embeddings are searched against the FAISS index. So we are using we experimented with scalar quantizer, vector quantizer, index IVF. So we experimented with different components, and we decided that okay, scalar quantizer works well with FAISS as an index. So these embeddings are searched against the FAISS index, and then FAISS index would return the exact section where the answer to the question can be found, and then ultimately we can visualize the results. So in a nutshell, we are trying to also identify, okay, what are some of the relevant sections which are helpful for a user to identify the answer, as well as trying to determine, okay, what are some of the additional components that we can identify, a specific sentence maybe that may provide an answer to the question. So that was overall experimentations that we did. But finally, we used a combination of FAISS and USC to compare against the concept of Elasticsearch to see how the semantic search based information retrieval would work. So that was the overall gist of the experimentation that we did through this particular use case. So again, moving one step further and seeing how this particular indexing would work, because when I say that, okay, FAISS is basically holding all the information, and we are using USC embeddings to search against these FAISS index vectors. But how really the indexing is done in FAISS? So basically, now imagine the 120,000 articles converted into sentences. So we have n sentences extracted from these 120,000 articles. So it can be 1 million, 2 million, it can be 10 million, it can be 50 million. We don't know, because we have the articles ranging from different sizes and shapes. So we have n sentences, let's say, for the sake of representation. And from these n sentences, we generate encoder, or let's say embeddings, using EUSC. So we have universal encoder, which is taking the sentence as an input and generating a 512 dimension encoded vector, because FAISS stores an encoded vector as part of the index table. So now you can imagine we have n into 512 dimension vector. So if I, let's say, for example, take 10 million as number of sentences extracted from these 120,000 articles, you can imagine the size of this index table. And in real time, now you want to search against this entire vector. So cost of search as well as the accuracy of search matters in this case, because ultimately when somebody scores your search results, they ultimately see that okay, whether they were relevant to the question which was asked. So you can imagine the size of the vector that was created, and of course this was all developed on GPU, so you cannot use a standard CPU to develop or to build all of these things. So we used a GPU to kind of create this index table using FAISS. So this was all indexing. So we took the data set, we converted it into a set of sentences, we passed it through USC, we converted it into a 512 dimension vector, and then finally our search index is ready. Now we come to querying stage. So now we are at a stage where okay, we want to get the data or get the relevant results out of this FAISS. So we have a query text. We do the same thing. Now we treat query text as a sentence that needs to be searched against this entire FAISS index table. So we have a query text which is converted into a 512 dimension encoded query using USC again, and then now this encoded query is passed to this FAISS index table which we indexed here, and then it returns top matching documents using Euclidean distance. So the computation that happens when we pass a encoded vector to FAISS, it basically uses Euclidean distance, and it can also basically use BM25 like mechanisms to find the top matching documents, and then finally the results are visualized. So this is where you are passing a query, we get a response, and then finally we visualize the results. But it's not as easy as it looks, because now if we imagine we have a vector, or let's say a table of 10 million records into 512, each record has a size of 512 dimension. So how huge it will be. So that's the case where we had to experiment and see how this particular problem of, let's say, reducing the cost of search. So that was one of the major challenges that we wanted to solve when we experimented with FAISS. But just to take a step back and explain what USC is, in case some of you are not aware of it. So USC is of course a universal sentence encoder. It's a pre-trained sentence encoding model that we have used. So it can be used on different NLP tasks. It can be used for entity recognition. It can be used for classification. It can be used for clustering. So in one of our use case within our organization, we are actually using USC to kind of cluster some of the data points which are generated as part of the manufacturing process. So we can use USC for different components and different techniques, and it can work on any size of English text. So so let's say it can work on a variable length of, let's say, 512 dimension, or it can be anything. So the length of the text doesn't matter for USC, because what happens in some cases or in some prior embedding techniques, that was one of the challenge that we might see. But ultimately the output is a fixed 512 dimensional vector that we basically use. And now we are using this dimension vector to create embeddings for all our n sentences that are generated out of the 1 to 10 million, let's say, sentences that we have, or 120,000 articles that we have. Now, you must be having a question that, okay, how this was developed, or let's say how this was generated, because if we take size of the encoder itself, and if we run it on, let's say, 10 million sentences, for example, it will take forever on a CPU to run. But in this case, we used the SageMaker capability offered by AWS, where we used a 8 virtual CPU and one V100 GPU of 16 GB memory to train USC on 1 to 10 million sentences, depending on the size of the article. So you can imagine the size of the vectors that we are generating through these different textual components. So that's why, as I said in the beginning, it's very critical to use the right compute also to make your algorithms, or to do the heavy lifting of these large set of documents. So we have a English sentence, for example. We have something like "my phone is good." So what an USC encoder would do, it would basically convert this text into some form of numbers, which we call it as vectors. So that will represent the text in a vector form, so that neural networks, so downstream neural network or downstream machine learning models, can effectively process the data and identify the relevant results. So that's the reason that we experimented with USC, and we further decided to explore BioBERT, SkyBERT, which are more closer to the biomedical data. But this was part of an experimentation that we wanted to do, and that's the reason that we decided to go ahead with USC. Now let's look at FAISS. So what is basically FAISS? It's a capability offered by Facebook. So it stands for Facebook AI Semantic Search, and it was developed by Facebook AI Research. It's available under MIT license. Anyone can download and use it. You can experiment with your different components that you want to search. So if you want to build an effective search engine based on the semantics of the text, then this is one of the efficient library or a package that you can start exploration with. So it kind of offers a functionality where you can effectively search through billions of vectors. So that's the claim that Facebook has come up with, that you can have billions of vectors and you can search through these vectors effectively. And it can efficiently do a similarity search. It can efficiently store these, let's say, sentence embeddings that we create using the encoders, and then finally represent it as a index table so that we can use it for a searching mechanism. So I think this is the exact same step that we do when we do the indexing of the sentences. So we have n different sentences, we have different universal encoders, and then we store these vectors into the FAISS index tables. Now the question comes, how it will behave when we pass a query in a real time, because we have to ensure that the results are returned in an optimum time, because user doesn't have 10 minutes to wait for one research result. So that has to be a very basic criteria when you are developing any search engine or any search capability. So we had to experiment and explore various different components to kind of experiment and see, okay, which techniques would reduce the query time between FIS. So what happens is, typically we have techniques like product quantizer, scalar quantizer, and we have different inverted flat index components to experiment and see how we can reduce the time required to pass the query and get the response back. So we decided to experiment, say, scalar quantizer, product quantization, and then finally we ended up using index IVF flat technique. So for this technique to work, you need to have a index readily available. Okay, so you have to do all these steps to create the encoded vectors from the text. Then you have to create a FIS index table, and then once you have the FIS index table ready, then you can apply these techniques, because these techniques then internally convert these different vectors into different clusters, because ultimately it is using a Euclidean distance. So it basically forms k different clusters. Okay, so ultimately you will have total, so k should be somewhat similar to your total vector. So if you have, let's say, 8 million vectors, ideally your cluster should be of same size. It cannot be more because you have those many vectors only. So what happens is, when you pass in a query, instead of looking at the entire index table, it tries to look at, or it, let's say, tries to find for a specific cluster that is closest to what you are looking for. So ideally, rather than looking at 8 million records, you are, let's say, looking at 4 or 5 million clusters, which are ultimately reducing your search time by k. So rather than looking at set of records, we are looking at specific clusters, and it can be basically a simple technique that is implemented as part of this IVF flat technique. But what happens is, this may hamper the accuracy, because you can see the timings here. If you look at IVF1, or let's say IVF100, it takes at least 27 seconds to return, versus if you look at product quantization, where we try to reduce the dimensions of the vector, the speed is good, but when we looked at the accuracy, the results were absolutely wrong. So there is always a trade-off. If you want to, or let's say, if you want to reduce the time, automatically it's going to impact the accuracy. So that's why we ended up using the IVF100 as a technique to reduce the query time. So that was the overall uh, information, or let's say the logic that we used to reduce the query time using the FIS. Now moving to the Elasticsearch. Now Elasticsearch is one of the well-known NoSQL databases that we wanted to explore, because Elasticsearch offers features like doing ML modeling within Elasticsearch, or doing an embedding search within Elasticsearch. So it offers a lot of out-of-the-box features that we definitely wanted to explore, so that we can understand and see how the state of the art, or let's say how the products like Elasticsearch would work on these kind of data sets, which are large in nature. So we wanted to explore concepts of improved indexing and improved searching, because prior Elasticsearch versions used to have a very standard mechanism to search, and it used to take some time to get the results back. But now we wanted to experiment and see what are potentially the new features that can help us enable the faster searching, but also ensure that the accuracy is not hampered. So that is something that we wanted to explore through this specific Elasticsearch component. And we experimented with different components of embedding search. Of course, the embeddings were again USC, so no change there. But rather than storing these vectors, these encoded vectors into the FAISS index table, we are now storing it into the Elasticsearch index. So how these Elasticsearch indexes are created? We have, as I said, we have 120K articles that we collected from different sources. We do initial text processing using NLTK or any standard cleaning methodologies that we have. And then we extract both sentences as well as sections from the document, so that if you want to look at a very specific sentence that may provide an answer to the query that user has asked, you can return that, as well as a section where a potential answer can be identified. So we have stored both in this case, and then we converted these JSON documents into the different indexes, and now their embeddings are stored into sentence indexes. So we have section index and we have sentence embedding index. So now we have two different components on which we can search. So if we want to look at a very specific sentence that will be closer, or let's say relevant to the query that you are firing, then we can look at the embedding index. But in general, if you want to just do a sectional search, okay, using BM25 or using Euclidean distance, we can hit the section index and get the relevant section, but we may not get the actual sentence where the answer may be hidden. So that is something that we wanted to explore, and it worked really well. So when we experimented with Elasticsearch, I think the speed, of course, improved because it's an enterprise platform, as we know, but as well as the accuracy was improved, because when we tried to use techniques like IVF flat on FAISS, we saw that the speed improved, but the accuracy hampered. So here we were able to ensure that accuracy is stable, but we are still able to get the results in quick time. So that was the overall idea behind experimenting Elasticsearch and FAISS together. So just to summarize, so what was the overall architecture? Because we now created this as a solution. We are not looking at this as a offering, or let's say to some extent, we are not looking at it as a standalone engine. We created a solution out of it. So we started with 44 key articles. So we started this activity somewhere last year in August. Now we are at a stage where we have close to 120 key articles, which are used for training these different vectors. And then we use Elasticsearch in the backend to extract the data from these different documents. So that's why you see that we have started with 44 key articles, which was a base for our let's say the activity that we wanted to experiment. Then we do some text pre-processing. So how it would look like? We looked at FAISS indexing, that we have a sentence, then we have a encoder that is transforming the English text sentence into the 512 dimension vector. And now what we are trying to do is we are trying to see how we can replicate that part. So the first two steps are same. We do the text pre-processing where we try to lowercase the data. We try to remove the stop words if required. It may hamper the embeddings because embeddings try to look at the overall sentence. So it can be one of the technique that can be applied. And then the two pathways. First path can be for the section extractor, where we are not doing any encodings or we are not generating any embeddings. Instead, we are just extracting the sections and we are storing them into the Elasticsearch index. Then the second component, which replicates what we did in FAISS. So we extract sentences out of the articles or the documents. Then we apply the universal sentence encoder on top of it, which returns close to 8 million vectors from 44K documents. You can imagine how many vectors would be when we look at the 120K articles. So we have one vector for each sentence, and then now we are storing these embeddings generated from sentences into an Elasticsearch index. So now when we look at the searching scenario in real time, so we have a user. So it can be a business user, it can be a research user, and that particular user wants to search for a particular query. So what are the economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic? So what happens is there will be a pre-processing step that is applied. Then what we try to do is, if the query length is too small, because if you fire a very short query, the algorithm may not be able to understand what user is trying to look for. So ultimately what happens is, if the query length is less than 3 words, so it just says COVID-19 pandemic impact, then what we try to do is, since we don't have the detailed context what user tries to look for, we just search for this query against the section index of the article, and then we return the results like what you see here. And if the query has more than 3 words, which gives a context around what user is trying to look for, then we apply a BM25 based search on the section index. We get top and hits so that we get relevant sections wherein the answer can be found. Then we get relevant sentences from those sections. Then we apply the embedding techniques to get the encoders, and we search the embeddings against the sentence embedding index that you see here. But instead of using Euclidean distance here, now we are using cosine similarity, which is an improved version of BM25. And then we return the actual relevant sentences or sections here. So two different scenarios here. To save time, if the user has given very less information in the query, then we just return the section wherein potential information can be found. If not, you can get a very specific sentence identified from the article. So that's the overall architecture that we created for the entire use case. Then just to give you a comparative study based on our understanding, based on our observations that we did on our data set that we worked with. So I think it's very clear that FAISS is more or less vectors space search versus Elasticsearch is more keyword based search. So if you look at the previous architecture, what we have done is we have converted the query into, let's say, different words or different tokens, and now we are trying to do a search. But what happens is, since we created embeddings and we stored embeddings into the Elasticsearch, it is not just doing a typical keyword based search or a fuzzy match. Instead, it is trying to match embeddings against the embeddings of the sentences. So that's the advantage that we get. But also there are some benefits that you get out of FAISS, because FAISS builds a semantic vector. It basically, the fundamental idea behind FAISS is that it basically is built on top of the semantics of the text itself. So the idea is that it creates k closest vectors and then you search against those vectors. But here, nothing as such. We just try to map the keywords to the list of documents containing those keywords, and then we return the specific values out of it. In terms of the computation, Elasticsearch doesn't need computationally expensive GPUs, CPUs, or TPUs. It can work on a standard server or a cluster of servers, and it can search through millions of documents. That's how it is optimized. But FAISS needs a high-end GPU. As I said, we used a V100 GPU to train on 8 million vectors. So you can see that FAISS is computationally expensive because it tries to look at the embeddings in a way. Then, of course, Elasticsearch does not support GPU as of now. If there are subsequent versions, then there may be a plan to support GPU. But in case of FAISS, it definitely supports GPU. So if your organization or if you have access to a larger GPU, then definitely I would recommend to use FAISS, because as I said, more or less, this technique is specifically working on concept of semantics, so which is far better than a typical keyword-based search. But if you don't have that much of a compute, then definitely Elasticsearch is a better option. And then Elasticsearch can help us look at, or let's say search on a particular text or a keyword. Then we can again rescore on embedding. So it has various different permutation combinations. Since it supports embeddings, starting 7.x version, you can search against embeddings too. Or like what we did, we tried to look for a text or a section, and from that section, we tried to look at embeddings and then try to see, okay, what are the relevant sentences for that particular query. So that is something that can also be done. But nothing like this in FAISS. You can only search through vectors because they are the only ones which are holding the information. And then ultimately Elasticsearch can store the actual documents. So anytime if you want to see the results, you can just log into Elasticsearch and you can see the results in a nice user interface. But FAISS stores only numerical vectors because that's how it is built. So it works on the concept of n-dimensional vector, and then you can use that as an indexing technique to kind of search the results. So in a nutshell, this is about a comparative study that we did. So in a way, we are not trying to suggest that use a Elasticsearch or use FAISS, but Both techniques have strong points. So if you want to use a semantic based searching technique, definitely bias is better, or FAISS is better, sorry. Or if you want to use a nice search mechanism where you can see the results, where you can do both text based search as well as embedding based search in a significantly lesser time, along with less expensive in terms of GPUs, etc. So then definitely Elasticsearch can be a better choice. But both technologies have their pros and cons, definitely, for sure. So now coming to the outcome, because this entire exercise, this entire study that we discussed, or that I spoke about for last 40 odd minutes, was done as a part of the TREC COVID, which was organized by NIST, as I said earlier. So we had 5 rounds, and after the completion of 5 rounds, we received results. So what happens is, TREC, or the organizers of this TREC competition, they look at the results manually too. So they try to understand, okay, out of the total documents which were judged, how many were found relevant. So they had 30 topics, or they had 30 different queries which they gave us, and we fired those queries and we returned them the set of IDs which are talking about the documents. So they would manually, let's say, look at 50 different documents for each query, and they say, okay, out of those 50 documents, how many were relevant to the query. So you can see, let's say, for a query number 7 or 8, you can see all the documents that were judged, all were relevant. And to some extent, most of the documents, 80% of the documents were relevant in this case. To some extent, for specific complicated queries, it may have worked poorly, but overall, the approach that we used for BERT, or let's say USC, so it can be anything, BERT, USC, anything, plus BM25 and BM25 plus logistic regression, both worked well. So you don't have to specifically stick to USC, or you don't have to specifically stick to BERT, but BM25 Elasticsearch, or BM25 or Euclidean distance coming from FAISS, both can be used. So in this case, we don't have to share any model, we just have to share the results. So as you can see, when it comes to extracting top 5 documents, we were able to extract 83% times accurate, and it continues to reduce, because then you have to extract 30 exactly relevant documents. But out of the total 25 submissions, the 22 submissions, so in this competition you can do 3 things. It can be purely manual, where users can manually find the documents and submit it. It can be partially manual, where a machine is kind of suggesting a document, then human intervention is happening, and some corrections are happening, and then we are getting the results. And then finally, purely automatic, where there is no human intervention except training, testing, validation, improvements, etc. But end to end, the results are generated automatically. So in that case, out of total 22 submissions, we were ranked 13, which means that out of all the submissions which were using some kind of machine learning, NLP or AI, our solution was one of the best, because we were able to achieve a greater precision along with a higher accuracy in terms of extracting the relevant documents. So that is something that we experimented, and we tried to learn and see how we can use some of these techniques, and then we can see how it can be ranked globally. So that's the overall outcome of the TREC, on which this entire use case or this study was built on. And then in a nutshell, this is a current view of the system. So unfortunately, due to the restrictions, I cannot show you the live system, but I somehow managed to take a snip of it. So you can see that this is a live system where we can pass in any type of query. So currently it shows what are the economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. And what it returns is basically a section from the journal. Let's say this is the particular article which is talking about, or let's say having a closest information relevant to this particular query, and it highlights that particular section. So that's the reason we worked with sentences rather than sections directly, because if we would have done a keyword search, we may not be able to find a specific sentence where this information can be found out. But the idea was to identify and highlight this specific section where users can definitely enter into this article and see the actual text. And then there was a hyperlink which was offered also. And then we can select a particular publications too. So it can be PMC, it can be any journal that a particular research user or a particular user is interested or keen to look at. So that's the overall view of the system that we developed as part of this COVID-19 literature exploration. So just to summarize, what are the next steps? So if you remember the high level system view, we had 3 phases. So we completed the phase 1 successfully, where we kind of developed a semantic search based on sentences and paragraph. We saw, or we experimented with concepts like FAISS, USC, Elasticsearch, etc. Now we were able to identify sentences. Now, can we identify factual answers? So the example that I gave earlier, what is the incubation period of coronavirus? So the factual answer is like 3 to 7 days, 16 to 14 days from the documents itself. We are not going to create any separate training data for this. From the documents itself, can we get these factual answers directly with some kind of confidence, as you see here? So we started experimenting with concepts of retriever and reader based approach, which ultimately uses BERT in the background to kind of experiment and see how it works. And then experimentations are still going on. And the final ultimate step is to use reinforcement learning to some extent, where we can improve on the fly based on the user feedback that we receive. So still a long way. Definitely, this has a lot of potential, because we don't want to look at this just from a perspective of COVID. Of course, it kind of served the purpose of identifying relevant information at the right time. But from a perspective of explorations and adding or implementing or experimenting with state-of-the-art concepts of reader retriever or BERT or reinforcement learning, just to see how it works on such large amounts of data. So that was one of the experimentations that we want to continuously do in this area. And then with this, I would like to thank everyone for patiently listening. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. Thanks to organizers. And yeah, I'll then open up for any questions. I can see some questions in chat if I'm not wrong. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so if I see the questions here, so one question from Dev is, how literature search about COVID different from literature search of other topics? No, there is no difference. The idea here is to explore and see what kind of information related to COVID specific topics we can identify. So it can be about COVID, it can be about, let's say, anything, any other disease, but specifically TREC decided to start with COVID related literature. So we started experimentation specifically for COVID literature, but there is no hard and fast rule that this technique can work only on COVID related articles. It can be on any specific articles if we want to use it. Yeah, it was Skybird. So I'll just ping the name in the chat. So one is Skybird, which is developed on clinical trial or the biomedical data. One is BioBird, which is purely developed on PubMed. So BioBird has 3 components. So one that is developed on, let's say, a few 100,000 PubMed articles, one that is developed on 1 million articles, and one which is larger one that is developed on 5 millions one. So that is something that you can explore and experiment. So Skybird, SCIBERT. Yeah, FAISS is basically, as I said, Facebook AI semantic search component, which they open source like Google did, USC and BERT one. So we try to experiment with it. So the next question from Dev is, wouldn't you expect information from multiple sentences to be needed to answer a query? If so, how can a matching query to one sentence work? Yeah. So what we are doing in this particular scenario is, we are, first of all, if you remember the Elasticsearch based approach, in this case, for example, we are first trying to identify a section from different documents, and then within those different sections, the answer can be in multiple sentences too. So for example, from the same article, we may identify 3 sections, and from those 3 sections, we may identify 4 sentences which are giving a potential answer to the query which is asked. So it can be either ways. So either we embed, or let's say either we encode the sections data and we store that sections into FAISS, then we apply the first search on that sectional FAISS, then we get the output, and then we can apply on the next or the second FAISS. But in case of Elasticsearch, what we did is we basically searched, we did a keyword search on a section, and then we did an embedding search on the sentences. So we can get multiple answers too. Yeah. So again, a question from Dev. What do we mean by precision at 5 documents? So when we fire a query, okay, we return X number of documents. Let's say we return top 100 documents, for example, as a result or as an outcome. So when we say accuracy or precision at 5 documents, which means the top 5 documents which are written by the system are 83% accurate. So that's how TREC calculates the precision. So what is the precision at first 5 documents which are returned for a particular query? Then at top 30 documents. So the precision is 63%, which means that the top 30 documents which are returned by the machine or the algorithm that we have, those are 63% accurate. So that's how TREC scores the model or the version. What database you use to store the results in a table? We used Elasticsearch in and out for storing the data, because since the data was in JSON format, we most of the times use the information for storing the data and for visualizing the results. Yeah, so I hope I was able to answer your questions, Dave, and few other colleagues who asked it. So in case you have any questions, feel free to ask now, or you can reach out to me later too, and I'll be happy to answer any of your follow-up questions in this case.
Thank you, Prathamesh. It was a great talk. And now we're gonna do this first time. We're gonna actually go to breakout rooms and have a network sessions. We're gonna do it in 2 different sessions, each one 5 minutes. So when we go there, we just introduce ourselves, who we are and where we're from and what we are doing and what attracts us to data science and what will be the actually hot and trending areas in data science and AI. That will be a good ice breaking, but it's actually a freestyle talk. It's a networking session. So if our friends can start the breakout rooms, I will appreciate it. Thank you, guys. It was a good experience. Actually, some of the people dropped out going there. And we're gonna actually repeat that. And this is the first one is good. We probably will give more time for the sessions. And I think we have a time limitation. We're gonna do this one more often, and we're gonna actually stop here.
So Murat, this is Jay. Just wanted to understand how this break room session work. Is it that something that Zoom has that feature that automatically take the small set of group and make a breakout room?
Yeah, actually, you just can assign it how many people wanna in the room, but how many rooms, and it is automatically assigns people to rooms. So we don't.
Awesome. No, this is something for the first time I participated, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we're gonna do it more often. Actually, you can actually move from the rooms to rooms, which I realize it now too. So if you don't see anyone in your room, so we see that we made the groups in 5 people, and then we're gonna make it 10. Not everyone available or can talk, so we're gonna make it and actually more groups, and then there will be 3-4 people can talk and converse. Actually, this is a big room. There is that much people, even enough. So that was good. I think it's a good experience. This is what the networking is when you go to meetups here in Bay Area. It's basically the same thing, but you can hang out as much as you want in the real life. So we're gonna figure out this one more. Do you guys have any questions, or we can end it up today? Great. Thank you for everyone participating. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Murat, and everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, guys. And thank you, Murat, for facilitating it. That was awesome. I'll look forward to some other meetups. And thank you, Prathamesh. It was awesome. A lot of more learning for me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Looking forward to meet you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Definitely.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.